Now let me mention a couple of terms to you. Pick-up artists, men's rights activists, trolls. Now if you're a woman who's been on the wrong side of online harassment, it's likely that any or all of them will be familiar to you. They're all communities within the so-called manosphere. That's corners of the internet where men congregate to discuss their masculinity and what they see as the corrupting force of feminism. Another one is incels.
Incel is a shortening of involuntarily celibate, but it's a word that's come to mean much more than its literal definition. Bizarrely, it was actually coined by a woman more than 2 decades ago. She started an internet chat group designed to be a safe space for people to share their woes about being unlucky in love.
Guy's name, we call him Prince, bald already.
In the years following, incel community membership soared, spread out across the internet, and morphed into something much more sinister.
The basic incel values include a real hostile attitude towards women and a feeling of profound injustice about the lack of access to sex.
The community sits within a realm known as the manosphere, an online network of men who oppose feminism and encourage misogyny. At the core of the identity is a belief that men are society's true victims and that sex from women is something they're entitled to. At the extreme end, incels advocate for the legalisation of rape and keeping women as slaves. To the uninitiated, conversations between incels online are hard to understand. Their language is laden with jargon. Attractive men are Chads, attractive women, Stacys. And someone who's come around to the incel way of thinking is said to have been red-pilled, in reference to the film The Matrix. Though the community is based online, incel violence regularly makes its way into the real world.
Not all incels are violent, not all incels are likely to radicalise, but at the same time, as a group, being a member or subscriber to incel does mean that you are more likely to radicalise.
According to research by the University of Western Australia, between 2014 and 2018, 50 deaths in the United States and Canada were attributed to violence by members of the incel community. Perhaps the best-known instance of violent misogyny is the 2014 Isla Vista killings, when 22-year-old Elliot Rodger murdered 6 people and injured 14 others in a carefully planned shooting spree that began at a sorority house.
And I turned around and I started walking the other way.
In a video created the day beforehand, he said he was taking revenge on the beautiful women who had denied him sex and affection.
He actually wrote a manifesto, which other incels have subsequently referred to.
Australian man Brenton Tarrant, who also published a manifesto before he killed 51 people at 2 Christchurch mosques, was a regular user of message boards popular with incels. Social media organisations have made attempts to shut down incel groups. In 2017, message board Reddit banned a community with more than 40,000 members. But some say public statements of misogyny need to be treated as a national security threat.
When somebody comes out and attacks a senator because of a sexual history, for instance, those kind of statements actually provide support and succour to people who may commit terrorist attacks.
That was The Drum's Ruby Cornish. And for more on this, we're joined in London by the founder of the Everyday Sexism Project and author of Men Who Hate Women, Laura Bates. Laura, welcome to The Drum.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, congratulations on your book. It's very sobering reading, but it's compelling reading. I mean, the subtitle, The Truth About Extreme Misogyny and How It Affects Us All. Some people will say this kind of extremism is best ignored. Why is it important that we understand men who hate women?
Well, I think the simple answer to that, as you've just covered, is because women are dying. You know, it is literally killing women, not only in the high-profile cases we hear about, and I link it to 100 deaths and serious injuries over the last 10 years in the book, but also at a more daily level in women's daily lives. If there are hundreds of thousands of men being radicalised online, and those are the kind of numbers I came across in my research, genuinely to believe that women are sexual objects, there purely for their sexual gratification, that will also be filtering down to have an impact on women's lives in the day-to-day, on rapes, sexual harassment, violence, workplace discrimination, that we might never really connect back to those communities. And if people don't know that this is happening, if we don't see it as a kind of radicalization, and if we don't call men terrorists when they act in the name of what is just as much a form of extremism and hatred as other forms of terrorism, then we can't tackle it.
And I want to come back to you on what these different groups look like and how so often what they say is just a beat away from some kind of violence. But Shalailah, I want to bring you in here now because you've had experience of kind of abuse and violent threats through someone who found you on Facebook.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, sure. So it started with a person who contacted me through my public profile page, which is all about my work. It doesn't have anything to do with my personal life. It's just showcasing what I do for work. They contacted me and it was very much, I'm sure a lot of women have this experience. It's completely not unique. But people think that because you're a public profile or you have a public profile, they can try it on. They can try the moves on. So this person did a bit of like, hey, how you doing? Do you have a boyfriend? You're really cute, that kind of thing. And I just wasn't having it. And I just kind of said, I'm sorry, this is not appropriate. If you think it's fine to message someone about their work and make it sexual, then you should go somewhere else, basically. This person turned very aggressive straight away, became really abusive. So I screenshotted and blocked them. They then found me on my personal Facebook page and started to continue the abuse there. It escalated to what's colloquially known as dick pics. I'm sure people will understand what I mean by that. But I thought, okay, this is not a normal type of behaviour. I did a little bit of research being a journalist, did a little bit of research on this person and found out that this person was actually wanted for war crimes. So they had an Interpol red notice out for them on war crimes.
Wow.
Which was fascinating because it goes to the type of person that does this. It's an intimidation. It's a form of abuse. It's something that they want to instill fear or disgust or some other kind of negative connotations. It's not someone just being, having a lark. It's actually a form of abuse. So then I took that to the AFP, given he has an Interpol red notice out. I was like, here you go, here's some dick pics, see if they work to identify where this person who's fled might actually be. But what was really interesting about that process of then filing to the AFP was how shocked the officers who came to take my statement were by the abusive messages, which kind of highlighted to me that they've never really been on the internet in the way a lot of public profile women, particularly women of colour, have been. So it was, again, another reminder that there is a little bit of a schism with how we use technology, how embedded it is in our lives, and how maybe law enforcement views technology as well. So it was a whole gamut of, experiencing everything from a kind of microaggression that women might experience every day all the way through to kind of following it up with law enforcement too.
Right, and so many things about that experience, one of which is how often women are approached by someone in either like a coquettish or a come-on kind of way.
Yeah.
They're ignored or rejected and then quickly to the abuse, quickly to the violence and the aggression, which is something you write about a lot in your book, Laura. I want to ask you about, there's so many it's not a homogenous group you write about. So you talk about incels, trolls, pickup artists, MGTOW, I think men going their own way, and MR, men's rights activists. But one thing I noticed reading through your research is how much all of these groups quickly, there's a thread of rape, of non-consensual sex right throughout it, an active incitement to rape. Reddit shut down a community of 40,000 just a couple of years ago after a user asked how to get away with rape. There's a lot of talk about legalising rape. There's a concern with false rape or domestic violence allegations, which are portrayed as extremely likely. A pickup girl, how to pick up girls, had to edit out references to rape. Just 2 years ago in Australia, Facebook Blokes Advice Group, with more than 500,000 members, was shut down for glorifying rape and violence. What does this tell you about what these groups have in common?
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that misogyny, that a hatred of women and that a real dehumanisation of women the perception of women as purely sexual objects, and specifically the perception of women as second-class citizens who are there to be used by men, really kind of runs through these groups. Of course, they're not homogenous groups, as you've said. There's a great deal of complexity here. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and of course, within that, we see victims, we see men who have real, genuine problems that aren't being tackled elsewhere in society, which drives them to these groups. We have men who have real issues that they're facing, but it is not right to suggest that those are just a few outliers and that these groups are largely harmless. And I think this undercurrent of this obsession with rape that you've picked up on is a good way of explaining that this is very much a community where the overall message is one that women are there for men to have sex with, that if they don't consent, they deserve to be raped, that men should be going out and raping women to take their rightful place of power over them. And if this sounds perilously close to a kind of white supremacist narrative, that's no coincidence either. There is a huge overlap between those two communities, as your highlighting of Brenton Tarrant showed, as the mention of women of colour facing the majority of online abuse reveals. These two communities are inextricably intertwined. There's huge racism in the incel community, and the white supremacist community and their beliefs are often predicated on extreme misogyny. But we are finally and belatedly starting to recognise that as a form of terrorism. But at the moment, we don't yet recognise even men who go out and massacre women in the name of this form of extremism as terrorists.
Laura, what are the points at which these ideas, I don't even want to think of them as a fringe, because you're more describing an underworld, or kind of more like a kind of sewage system. At what point does this bubble up into the mainstream, and how does this actually affect our lives, or potentially affect our lives?
Well, it has a really big impact because these men are actually extremely prolific. They're very good at getting their feelers out of the internet and into the offline world. In Australia and elsewhere, for example, some of these groups have caught the ears of policymakers. Some of the completely false facts that they invent about things like false rape allegations, or about men committing suicide because of supposed abuse from the family court system, have then found themselves being repeated by politicians on the national news. In America, for example, over a quarter of men in a recent survey said that they will now not have a one-to-one meeting with a female colleague on their own in the workplace. In Australia, a recent poll found that a huge number of people now believe that women lie in order to gain custody of children, that they lie about abuse in the family court system. There's lots of evidence that the complete myths and misconceptions that start online have really infiltrated our society and are influencing everything from our workplaces to our policy. And what's most worrying, I think, is that they are deliberately grooming and radicalizing very young boys in order to achieve that kind of increase of their message, that amplification. And they're doing it in very clever ways. They use viral YouTube videos. They use things like bodybuilding forums. They use gaming live streams where a teenager might be playing a game with headphones on in their bedroom with a parent perhaps not even realizing that a man somewhere on the other side of the world is whispering in their ear. So they're very effective at spreading their message, and it does have a wider impact.
Jane, have you ever experienced anything like this?
Not so much, and I think it's because of my age, one blessing. I don't get the kind of sexualised, rapey messages, because I think women over 60, over 50 probably, are to a lot of these men basically invisible. They don't even see us. I do get a lot of abuse when I speak up, and and it's sexist abuse. So it'll be things like, "You're just a bitter, twisted, dried up old hag," to which I usually reply, "Bitter? No, not really. Old? Yes, it's a statement of fact. Twisted, according to my Pilates teacher. Dried up? Yes, and what a relief that is. Hag? Absolutely, claiming that status proudly." I have had people threaten to kill me on a number of occasions. One man, an American, tracked me down a bit like Shalailah, through all my various Facebook pages, and said to me, I'm a Marine and I know 70 ways to kill you with my bare hands. And I went back and said, that's very impressive, but surely one would do. I mean, I know I'm sounding flippant, but one of the things I have learnt with the abuse is that online, trolls want to control your emotion. I think a lot of what this male obsession with keeping women down is about is domination and control. They want to control us in some way that helps them to feel like they're controlling themselves. I don't quite understand that. But one of the things I've realised is that they want to control what kind of an emotional response you have. So they might want you to be afraid. They might want you to feel humiliated. They might want to make you angry. Now, when I get that kind of abuse, it doesn't mean I don't feel those emotions, but I've learnt never give them that. Never let them see that they've got that emotional response from you, because that's what keeps them going, because then they're controlling you. They're pulling your strings. And I can't wait to read Laura's book. And I'm so pleased that we're starting to talk about this stuff seriously. And I'm thinking very much about coercive control, which I know we're now talking about criminalising, and has happened in, I think, parts of the UK. And that this sounds, again, very much, a lot of that is about men who insist on their wives having sex with them every night or whenever they want, and that they're controlled utterly. And this is something we really need to talk about more broadly. And we also know that a lot of famous terrorist incidents, including Port Arthur, began with domestic violence, the murder of a woman in the family, a mother, a sister, a partner. This hasn't been looked at either.
That's definitely something that Laura looks at. But I want to ask you, Christopher, another thing that Laura talks about when she looks at the connection between some of these groups and into the mainstream. There are some people who kind of serve as conduits, or as kind of empower people to hold certain attitudes. Now, I remember when Donald Trump was elected in 2016 that we had this footage of students at Sydney University shouting, grab them by the pussy, right? That chanting it instantly when he was elected. And is there a question about what political leadership or what political examples can do when it comes to attitudes to women? And is it not of concern that there are two women in federal parliament who've had lawsuits over being slut-shamed in recent years?
Right, well, I'm certainly aware of Sarah Hanson-Young. I wasn't aware that there was a second.
Emma Hassan.
Oh, of course, Emma.
Yeah, they're literally lawyers arguing about what a slut was in these court cases.
Look, this is one of the bizarrest parts of our modern world. Sure, the social media has been a net positive, probably, but one of the great negatives of it is allowing these people to come in contact with each other. And before social media, it was much harder for them to do so. So if there were people with these clearly warped views, they might find people eventually who agree with them in their town or their city or their country, but it was much, much harder. But the problem with the social media is that it allows these things to proliferate, and it's quite evil. When I agreed to do Twitter and Facebook many years ago, I was a late bloomer on the social media. One of the reasons was because I thought it was so negative in many respects, but I only agreed to do it if I never read the comments.
Right.
So I've never read a comment. So all those people out there who are commenting on my Twitter and Facebook page and telling me what a toe rag I am, I have to let you know I don't know about it, because it's just, I mean, it has to get to you. I mean, look, all these poor
Can you see that it's gendered? Can you see that what happens to women?
Oh, it's much worse for women.
Yeah.
And of course, political leadership has to lead by example. And that was one of the reasons Donald Trump was completely unsuitable to be the President of the United States. It wasn't the only one. And thank goodness that America has woken up and changed the presidency a month ago. Because imagine if Donald Trump had been re-elected and had been endorsed with the quite unhinged White House that we've put up with in the last 4 years.
Vyom, just quickly, because I just want to move on to another part of this discussion. You've been online. Have you noticed women, female colleagues being treated differently to you?
Oh, look, I mean, for me, 2020 was a big year in terms of using social media and personally saying some controversial and provocative things. And the first thing that happened was my colleagues who are women reached out to me and said, hey, hope you're okay. We know things can get pretty full on in terms of abuse. And that's when I realised how gendered it was, because I've had virtually no abuse, very, very little. And for the first time, I realised what they've been going through for years. So it's completely just a different experience, and actually listening to these women's really kind of woken me up to how incredibly gendered some of this abuse is. Really has not as much to do with the things you're saying.
All right, now Laura, in your book you mentioned Jordan Peterson, the outspoken Canadian academic who won legions of fans with his book 12 Rules for Life. You say he feeds into gender stereotypes and is responsible for getting misogynistic ideas into the mainstream. Well, news that Peterson is to publish a follow-up book has been greeted with shock by staff at his publisher, Penguin Random House. According to reports, staff organised meetings to express their concerns and filed anonymous complaints to management. In a statement, Penguin Random House said, "We remain committed to publishing a range of voices and viewpoints." Laura, where do you stand on this? Do you have sympathy with the staff who are objecting?
I understand what they're saying, and I think it is important to look at the kind of mainstream figures who provide what might be seen as kind of dog whistle messages that embolden these groups in the same way that we've discussed with Donald Trump. But I also think we have to talk about this very carefully, and we do have to balance it with freedom of speech. What I suggest in my book, in Men Who Hate Women, is not necessarily that figures like this need to be silenced or that that they shouldn't be allowed to speak. But of course, there is a difference between freedom of speech and being given a massive publishing platform to speak to a huge number of people. I think what's more important for me really is tackling the societal norms and attitudes that enable these kinds of messages to take hold when they happen. Clearly one person isn't the issue on their own. The issue is a society where very subtle messages about women from an incredibly young age leave people poised to be affected by these kinds of rhetoric. And it's a much bigger problem, I think, than just one person.
Christopher, would you publish Jordan Peterson?
No.
Why not?
Well, my take on this is that the CEO or whoever makes those decisions at the publishing house should have said, we don't publish books like that.
Because you think it's user offensive, or because why?
Because I think that if you own the company or if you run the company, then you have to make values-based decisions. And but once that decision's been made to publish the book, I think it becomes a freedom of speech issue. So I think the CEO or whoever makes the decision should have said, well, we don't publish books like that here, but maybe somebody else can publish your book, but we don't do that. And that would have been a perfectly reasonable decision. It's not a freedom of speech issue. It's just, the company's allowed to make values-based decisions. Having made that decision, I do think that they have to go through with they must have known what the book said before they decided to publish it. So it's not like they can say, oh, now we've found out that it's no good. Or that these views are unacceptable views. Unfortunately, I think the staff are kind of stuck with either leaving the company or publishing the book. I don't think that they can now say, we're going to shut this book down, because that's where it becomes a freedom of speech issue.
Jane, where do you stand?
Yes, I think I agree with Christopher, actually. I think...
Gosh, again.
Yes, I know, it's very strange.
Crazy.
More politicians should leave politics. They become so much nicer. And their views improve. Look at Matthias Cormann. No, I think I agree with Christopher, because I think that's right. I think it's up to the publisher to look at the book. And personally, I don't think Jordan Peterson's much of a writer, so that would be a good reason not to publish it. But once the decision has been made to publish, then I think it has to go through. The other thing is, I do think the protests, although I completely understand where the staff are coming from, probably are, Jordan Peterson's publicist and possibly publisher are perhaps thrilled to pieces with all this publicity, because it'll be attracting an enormous number of people, just the sorts of people that Laura is talking about, to line up and buy that book and make it a bestseller. So it's, I wish the publisher had made an ethical decision not to publish it.
Vyom, where do we draw the line with deplatforming?
It's a really tough one, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that I do get quite uncomfortable about these issues. Just recently, many people, and I was one of them, campaigned against Pete Evans, who was being, I would argue, much more egregious than Jordan Peterson, literally posting up, Nazi cartoons and posting bad health advice that could get people killed. So sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly where to draw the line, but at times it's just obvious when the harms are going to be very direct. Now, as far as Jordan Peterson goes, he says a lot of things that I find just wild and crazy and disagree with. But I think we have to pay attention to the content of the book he's going to write. I mean, if this is going to be some kind of anti-feminist manifesto, that's one thing. But if this is just going to be the same old thing he's doing, which is this very individualized self-help book, and a lot of them can be incredibly repetitive in their content, then so be it. It's important though that I think the controversy might be getting blown out of proportion. We're seeing some good freedom of speech on both sides. The employees, I think they have a right to say what they want to say and what they disagree with, and the publisher has a right to make their decision, and that's that. So to me, we're just airing out views. No one's being harmed, and I do agree with Christopher, Jane, and Laura. In fact, on this, if the publisher's made the decision to publish it, that's that, and that's the business model here. And I think the employees have to respect that.
Laura, do you see this as a healthy sign going forward, given that you're concerned about these issues and are raising these issues? And I guess I want to ask you before we lose you. You write a lot. I mean, obviously your concern is with hatred of women, how it spills out into violence, some of the real life ramifications. You say we need to be taking it more seriously. What do you think ultimately these men that you've written about are afraid of?
Well, I think we're seeing a backlash to positive progress in society. I think that whenever civil rights movements have advanced, there has been a sense of terror that they might be taking something away or somehow attacking a different group, and I think that's the case here. I think people see women's rights making progress, although we still have a long way to go, and they think that something is being taken away, that a kind of birthright is being taken away from white men, middle-class white men. And I think that, that does suggest that there is progress happening, but also that if you look at the sheer scale of the backlash, I mean, you've got a panel here where every woman has experienced some kind of abuse or harassment. It shows that we're not there yet and that we still have a very long way to go. The fact that, yes, we're making some incremental progress, but that I received 200 rape and death threats in a single day from men graphically describing which knives they'd used to disembowel me with, shows that there is a sense of fury and of terror. I think there is a fear from men that we are trying to take something away from them, which of course isn't the case. The equality that we're talking for and aiming for would be beneficial for everybody.
Well, and I know you've been attacked quite savagely in the past. I think you've got a lot of courage to continue writing about it and airing these issues. So thanks so much for joining us this evening, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
And if these topics have raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732.